Hello. Welcome to our webinar, Engaging Physicians, Patients, and Payers via Online Discussion Platforms, which is the first of 3 webinars in our Innovators in Life Sciences series. Please look out for invitations for future webinars this fall. I am Steve Etzler with Business Development Institute. BDI produces thought leadership programs on the latest trends, issues, and opportunities facing business leaders. I would like to first thank our speakers, New Solution Factory's partner and Chief Creative Strategist, Natanya Wachtel, and Within3's founder and CEO, Lance Hill. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Within3, for making this webinar possible. And of course, thank you to you, our attendees, for investing your valuable time with us today. We have a very simple agenda. The webinar will run for 60 minutes. The first portion will consist of a joint presentation from both Natanya and Lance. The last portion of the webinar will be a moderated question and answer session with you, the audience. We strongly encourage your questions, so please submit them through the GoToWebinar platform. The webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available after the event. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Lance and Natanya.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Lance Hill. I'm going to go ahead and show my screen here, and hopefully everyone can see that. But I'm Lance Hill. I'm the CEO and founder of Within3. And by way of background, just to give you a little bit of perspective of the lens I'm going to bring, and Natanya will be introducing herself as well a bit later in the presentation. We're a company that focuses on building venues that allow life science companies to connect with external stakeholders, patients, payers, physicians, that sort of thing. We're not an agency where we are doing medical communications or analysis or that sort of thing, but we do work around the world with 18 of the top 20 pharmaceutical companies at this point, a large number of mid-sized and small biotech, medical associations, etc. So the point of view that I'm going to bring to the presentation is more aligned with social media overall, and what some of the trends are and some of the different types of venues. And then Natanya will be jumping in a bit later to focus on some of the ways that you can analyze and understand what's happening in those different venues and the value that that can bring to life science teams really across the life cycle. So with that, I will go ahead and jump in. And as Steve said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the GoToWebinar interface at the end of the presentation. We will sort all those questions and kind of field them between Natanya and myself and hopefully provide you answers. And if for whatever reason we run out of time and do not have time to answer all the questions, we could follow with written follow-up after the fact. So the first thing I'd like to do is start out with a brief tour and overall of the what I call the online discussion healthcare landscape. So these are all the places where healthcare constituents, again, patients, payers, healthcare professionals, will get involved in kind of the social media style, online over time type of discussion. Environments that may be open for several days or several weeks, or environments that are open 24/7. And what we find is that healthcare professionals and others are using these environments in combination. And so I thought it would be good as a level set to talk through what some of the trends are and where those are. So the first set, in focusing in on healthcare professionals, is around basic social media. And hopefully, I think in this day and age, everyone is very familiar with a lot of the main social media sites. Physicians especially do use these sites. You see a lot of physician blogs led by kind of activist physicians in different regards, but also on a personal level, using the same sorts of social media sites that you and I would use in our daily lives. These sites have been around, obviously, since kind of the mid-2000s and have been gaining very widespread adoption for personal and professional use, but they do have limitations. And so when you're talking about healthcare professionals specifically, what you don't see in these sites is a lot of kind of patient case conversation. You're obviously not able to look at medical records or anything private within these sites. And there's also a fear of liability, so that as a practicing physician, I'm one phone call away from a malpractice attorney of having a very bad day. And so usually within these sites, the security and liability weaknesses prevent a lot of the serious work from happening. But what does happen within these sites is the opportunity for advertising, for outreach, for awareness, and a lot of conversation happens in these different venues that is maybe more healthcare policy or practice management or general sorts of things that don't really have the confidentiality burden that would exist for patients. And so in response to that, a number of companies over the years have tried to solve the confidentiality and security problem by becoming what I'm terming a Facebook for Doctors type of site. And so these sites work a little bit differently. So these are private companies, and I've listed 6 here on the screen. There's a number, some have kind of come and gone over the years, but what they all try to do is address that core problem to get deeper dialogue and deeper exchange by increasing the level of security. So all of the companies listed here will vet participants into their networks. So they're private networks or private online communities or private social media sites that work very much like how a Facebook would work. But the idea is that you cannot join these unless you are an accredited physician, as an example. And the different sites have different criteria for who they allow in. Some sites allow nurses, some don't. Some of these sites are just US. Some of them are external or global. But all of them are trying to be kind of the Facebook for Doctors or a LinkedIn for Doctors type of site. They all have networking capabilities. They all allow physicians to post patient cases and talk. They all, and from a business model perspective, they're all pretty similar in that what they do is they market direct to physicians or nurses or whoever their constituency is. They try to get to a critical mass of participation on their sites, and then they offer back to industry various sorts of advertising or opportunities for market research or access to their network. So a lot of companies, especially in the commercial side of the business, on the life science side, may be interacting with one or more of these companies as part of their overall ad spend, or perhaps pursuing kind of deeper maybe panels or that sort of thing with some of these types of companies. You'll see all of these companies really discuss how many physicians they have in their network or that sort of thing. So they're all kind of competing on, we have a bigger or more active network than the other one. But at a core, that's kind of what they're all doing. So you tend to get within these broader communities a little bit of a deeper set of content, more discussion on things like around therapies or opinions on therapies, or opinions on trends that are a little bit deeper, because that social barrier of most of these sites I'm not anonymous, and so people can kind of see who I am and I can see who my peers are, and B, they're theoretically not open to a lot of audiences who can misinterpret what I say or misappropriate what I say and that sort of thing. So the vetting is higher and the content is higher. And then finally, at the top, oops, I'm sorry, let me go back one, going the wrong way. Finally, at the top of the pile is organization-owned sites. And so these are companies that are using social media platforms and technologies to build their own networks or communities for their own specific purpose. And that includes medical associations who are doing this very frequently with healthcare professionals, but also life science companies as well. All the companies we work with are doing this to one degree or another, either with small groups and things like advisory boards or steering committees, or in very large groups. And in this particular case, it's a bit different in that the value of these types of things when an organization is doing it themselves is not so much advertising. It tends to be deeper. It tends to have very strong vetting. You know who everyone is, and the content can be very specific and in some cases very confidential types of things being discussed. But it's not really a reach game where you're focusing necessarily on kind of broad networks. It tends to be a bit more focused and concise or specialty driven. And so as I mentioned, across all three of these spectrums, the audiences are active. I may belong as a physician to Facebook. I may also use one of the doctor networking sites that's in the Facebook for Doctors category. And I may also be participating in some of these organization-owned sites. And that's just becoming more and more common, that there's not a single source, but depending on who I am and what I'm interested in, what my relationships are, I'm going to be participating across multiple of these categories. So what about patients? Patients are also now extremely active on various sites as well. And so just to give you a snapshot of what that looks like, you can also categorize patient interaction in those three areas also. Basic social media with patients, you obviously get a much broader array of the things they tend to use. And also you can get deeper content from the basic social media sites because a lot of patients they don't have a concern with sharing their own information. You get a lot of folks who are just kind of putting themselves out there. There are a lot of patient-only or patient-centric types of sites by third parties. And again, a lot of organizations are creating their own venues for specific reasons for patients as well. And then finally, payers. Payers is a constituency that is increasingly important in everything we do within life sciences. And when you look at how that is rolling out, what you're missing in that arena is really kind of the Facebook for Payers types of networks. Those aren't really out there or highly active yet. And so what you are left with, though, is a lot of organizations creating venues for payers themselves for their specific purposes or specific sets of relationships, as well as the idea that these folks are all on basic social media platforms like everybody else. So that's kind of an overview of the online discussion landscape. And what we're going to do in the balance of the webinar, myself and Natanya, is go through some different case studies for different slices of what you see here, and hopefully give you a sense of what some of the value that can be driven and what some organizations and firms are doing. So with that, I will turn it over to Natanya.
Thank you. Hi, as previously introduced, I'm Natanya Wachtel, and my background comes in an amalgamation of science, technology, marketing, and healthcare, where I found there was a lot of interesting things on the academic side, studying behavioral psychology and behavioral science, but having been on marketing teams and brand teams inside of the pharmaceutical industry, found a lot of need to do some bridging between some of our marketing practices and what customer-centric outside of pharma, consumer packaged goods industries had been capitalizing on, and spent time working through the system and then founding an organization of consultants with different specialties to help work with our clients are also in the pharmaceutical manufacturer space, but also partnering with groups like Within3 who have access to a lot of great information and data and insights that we can layer on some thinking and modeling to hopefully get to some end results that work best for the customers as well as the manufacturers and partners. So layering on to what Lance was talking about in terms of the environment of the physical places, if you will, physical virtual places, thinking about what all of this means in totality is a hard thing, and there are many webinars that do this in much more detail. But ultimately wanted to kind of shift to the thinking for the case studies to the lens around it's not just that there is social media now and everyone is mobile now only, that there are essentially behavior patterns between and amongst these different types of stakeholder groups. So patients to caregivers and care partners, patients and organizations, physicians to patients, payers, the access, the interplay, and the interconnectedness are greater than ever before. So everybody is working in their own universe, getting information, sharing ideas at different levels of trust, anonymity, convenience, and all of those things, as well as the interdependence. And that's also been, as again experienced in sort of the consumer packaged world, probably firstly, the openness of the feedback directly to recipients and manufacturers and brands about what they expect in terms of customer service. I'm sure many of you have followed some recent posts from physicians about, I tried to call and get a script adjudicated, you know, and it was at 20 minutes and he recorded it and posted it. And just giving the feedback on customer service matters even in healthcare, and we can't get away with just blaming other people for any of the hiccups around getting people access to the medications that they need. So that's sort of what this slide is trying to show. Our approach tries to look at something that many of you have also probably seen before, but it often gets overlooked, around the interplay between information and knowledge that people might need to have about a product or a service or a resource, and what are their core beliefs? Where are they coming from when they come to get that information from you? And what resources do they have? These things, when they're separated, can give you an inaccurate picture about what is appropriate in terms of educational messaging, resources, supplements, elements to include in a phase 3B of a trial for QL, quality of life measures. So we really try and make sure that we look at things from multiple angles before recommendations are made. And now I guess Lance will tee up the first study.
Yep. So what we'd like to do now, just with that backdrop and overview, is go into some case studies of things that organizations are actually doing in the space and some of the value and benefits that they're getting out of it. And so the first one is a large community in the gastroenterology space that is sponsored by Janssen, AbbVie, Shire, and Takeda. And it's called the ACG and CCFA IBD Circle. American College of Gastroenterology and the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, a couple of years ago, came together to try to solve a problem. And the problem was that as associations, part of their mission is to promote networking among different constituencies in the disease state, accelerate how quickly new science and new treatments can be adopted, and really perform that in a 24/7 way. And the traditional methods that associations use to do that tend to be, the annual Congress and a few regional meetings here and there. What they wanted to do is create a 24/7 online community restricted to their membership, who are, for the most part, all clinically practicing gastroenterologists, and afford them a place where they could very safely network and discuss with each other everything from patient cases, which happens very, very frequently, to general practice management types of issues, to new science and reactions to new data, and do so in a way that, while restricted to their membership and restricted only to clinical gastroenterologists, is still open enough that they can promote networking and interact with industry. And so they launched this about a couple of years ago, and now more than half of the U.S. clinical practicing gastroenterologists are part of and active in this network, and it really has become the place to be if that's kind of your specialty, to be able to interact with some of the leaders in the field. You can see the community leaders section here on the right. One of the things that they've done with this group is promote a set of leaders. These are some of the kind of the key opinion leaders in the industry across the country, and those people play a very active role in kind of curating and responding to and moderating different types of things that are happening within this particular community. It is very active, and as I mentioned, these four companies at the bottom today sponsor this particular community and receive information as part of that sponsorship that is kind of in an aggregate format. And so within three, our part of this is helping build the environment, help it keep it very, very active, and interacting heavily with the sponsors. And what's happened recently is there's so much information over the last 2 years across all the therapies in this category, and so many different comments and conversations, that ACG had asked us to help them do a better job at summing up what it all means, both for their own knowledge, but also so that those pharmaceutical companies who are involved can get a better sense of where the industry is based on the actual verbatim dialogue that's happening within the community, and do so in a way, obviously, without revealing confidential information that the association should not. And so with that was where we connected with New Solutions Factory to have them do that behavioral analysis piece of this to tie in what is a very active healthcare community with the kind of the so what and what does it all mean, what are some of the opportunities.
Thank you. So one of the first things, this may be similar to programs depending on the attendees' backgrounds that you run, where typically a lot of the reporting had to do with the volume of opens and responses and contributions and memberships and things like that, which were very useful to see. Is there interest? Is it growing? But what we were missing from the reporting and what the ACG had asked for was some simple ways. So this is a very visually simple way to look at that many of you have maybe seen. What are some of the things that are bubbling to the surface that are sort of the hot topics? Because there were a lot of topics, and as Lance mentioned, 2 years worth of information. So we started to just look at what, at a very high level, what was resonating with most folks. The other thing that this unique platform allows for that we could do is we could really look at granular level behavioral, trend, attitudinal, clinical questions that were not really found in other areas. So we've tried to look at how do these topics and then the related comments around them relate to other more public-facing platforms in terms of, are there things that are different that are being shared in the circle than in other platforms like, I'm assuming I can say their names, Sermo and things like that, partner platforms that are in more the public domain. So yes, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So we also tried to look at the types of things that were being said and classify them with a taxonomy that had to do with a so what. So we looked at certain, this is just a quick model to show you one of them, around here are some ways to organize all of these statements around a popular topic and see how we could bring forth for manufacturers and the sponsors where you might be able to help supplement with other clinical data, different types of speaker topics, extension topics, and things like that. But again, it wasn't always the overtly stated problem. So you have to look at things in a cluster around what are they. Remembering that a lot of the physicians are not necessarily wanting to disclose their deepest challenges and even fears. And this is a very complicated disease state that has treatment paradigms that are varied and patient responses that are varied for the same clinical indication with the same product. So there's a lot of tinkering style approach, and as Lance mentioned before, legal issues aside, people are really reluctant to share. But here we found people more and more willing to share on certain topics, and we thought those were really informative. Again, this is just a small extract of what we did to give you a sense of how we could organize things in ways that would help. And so for some products specifically, there was some polarizing content that was really interesting to look when you plot them out in a grid. And some of them were as basic as people not even being sure how to use certain products that the brands themselves had sort of established in other research endeavors, a sense from their ATUs and things like that, that physicians did have ease and comfort. But a lot of the discussion was that there actually wasn't. Underneath the surface, there was a lot of uncertainty. A lot of issues around, optimal dosing and switching. So it was just interesting to relay the verbatims and where they clustered and seeing what types of content produced the most raw and authentic types of responses. And that's how we were using another lens with that.
Okay, so that's just a quick roll through. And by the way, I will mention all of the case studies that we are presenting today, we do have a lot more information on. If you are interested, you can contact myself or Natanya or through the websites. But that case study was really focused on a broad HCP example where you're talking about thousands and thousands of users, a lot of unstructured information and conversation, and looking at it not just from a scientific lens, but also from a behavioral lens. This case study flips and it focuses on patients and takes kind of a different scale. And so in this particular one, this was a manufacturer, a pharmaceutical manufacturer, has products both on the market and in clinical trials in a disease state for a severe chronic condition. And for those of you who have any experience in that part of kind of the disease state, If you have a severe chronic condition or if you have a rare chronic condition, first of all, it can take a while for you to be properly diagnosed. And then because it's chronic, it's not as easy as, start this regimen and all is okay. It's something that you deal with pretty much throughout the rest of your life. The treatments may change over time. It may affect you emotionally or physically or professionally in different ways depending on where you are in its progression. And so in this particular case, the company had a scenario where there was also some competing drugs on the market as well and things that were coming, and they were really trying to get a better sense of the patient journey, not from just, what's the script, what do the scripts look like and that sort of thing, but really trying to understand things like how long did it take you to get diagnosed, what was going through your mind when you first found out that this is what you could have, in the period before your first treatment, how did you feel, how convenient was it to actually, receive treatments and those sorts of things. And they were doing that to be much more customer-centric, but also to make sure that the types of educational materials that they're creating, the way they're messaging, where they're messaging, and those sorts of things from an awareness are matching up with kind of the real experience of these patients. And so the original plan was that they were going to gather 40 patients together. They had a patient ambassador program running already. So some of the patients that they interacted with were doing like DTC types of commercials and those sorts of things. They had patients enrolled, as I mentioned, in a clinical trial. And then they had other patients who, they had some relationship with just through different mechanisms across the course of what they were doing. And the original plan was that they were going to do one-on-one interviews with about 40 patients and ask a series of questions to try to address some of these core needs that they had to better understand the space. And they decided not to do that, and instead created an online virtual discussion forum to invite those patients in two different groups. Group one, which was a group of patients that was not involved in an existing clinical trial, and then group two, a group of patients that were in fact involved in the clinical trial. And the reason that they did this was because in a more of like a phone call or an interview style, they were concerned about a few things. Number one was cost and scheduling. Number two was the ability to get patients to open up fully about what is, emotionally trying sets of questions for them, and especially to do that kind of over the phone with a disembodied voice that they really don't know very well. And they certainly were not in a position where it made sense to try to fly all these patients together to some locale. So what they did is they created an online discussion platform, and with that discussion platform, they were able to ask each of these patients all those one-on-one questions. The patients could log in, again, very Facebook style, and answer those questions, interact with the moderators, go as deep into specifics as they needed to. And they did that over the course of 7 total days. So as the patient, I could log in on Monday. I could then, kind of come back and have more conversation Wednesday evening if that's, that works for me and my schedule and where I'm at with my life. And ultimately what they got was 36 patients participating in the program, and 113 total pages of written transcript, the dialogue that they had with those patients over the course of that 7 days, which really served as an extraordinarily strong basis for them and their medical communications agency to analyze and understand what the sentiments were, what some of the opportunities were for them. And once that environment was ended, they did a post-survey to the patients themselves, who absolutely loved the experience and thought it was a great way to share their feelings and participate kind of safely. And then secondly, excuse me, they were able to figure out from that very specific courses of action what was going to take them forward. So it was a very successful program, and something that is increasingly common, where organizations are setting up these online environments for shorter periods of time, using them with different audiences for specific purposes, and running them more as a program versus the broad, always-on ACG, CCFA style community that we shared in the first case study. Okay, so the next case study is for Natanya.
Thank you. So following on another patient study, similar to the one above in the sense that there was a need to understand about the best way to not only message to patients, but to connect and actually impact change that was measurable. So we worked with a large brand that had an established history, large-scale, multi-million-dollar sets of advertising and tactics and websites and an app and even a CRM program and things like that. But the utilization comparatively to others in this category was very, very low across the board. So they were doing very few things that got engagement, but they were doing many, many, many things. That's sort of obvious, but we weren't sure, and no one from the company at the time was really sure why were some things getting a reaction and others weren't, and what kinds of reaction were we hoping for in terms of affecting positive change. There were some issues that were important to medication management around awareness and education on best use and practices of the treatment, that there was a product expiry issue that longitudinal and pharmacy data showed people were not refilling their medication in time based on analogs. And there was also other areas where there was some misconceptions when things were studied from a research perspective around even understanding how to take, use, and when to have symptoms that would be precursors to utilizing the medication effectively. So in a similar way to the examples above, but again, this is a more robust example, we tried to leverage a lot of partner programs, tools, and resources like Within3 has shared, where we could find the authentic conversations layered with other things around actual behavioral models, pharmacy data, models from other behavioral indicators from within the disease category, and start to look at what we could do that would be most important to all of the stakeholders, what we could do for patients or care partners and caregivers that was actually impactful. And that kind of meant a deconstruction before a reconstruction. And that's basically the approach that we took. But we did it in a way that was several weeks' time only, because it was built on leveraging a lot of existing tools and services, as well as the fact that the very capable partners that we worked with had a lot to bring to the table, but they were each kind of working independently. So we did that and ultimately came out with a plan that synthesized the number of things that we were doing. We layered in some indicators that we could measure around what makes someone do something differently, and can everybody be affected to do things differently? And of course the answer is no, you can't get everybody to do something differently. So we focused on the people that we can, that had expressed willingness through other things that we were able to measure about a willingness to change. And so we focused on leveraging those sorts of skills, the skill building, that they were motivated already, they had demonstrated that, and they were determined to kind of get the best from their treatment. And we focused on making tools and services and content that really fed to those behavioral models, as well as the expressed behaviors and attitudes and beliefs, as well as their overall channel uptake and preference across social, app, web, and print. Ultimately, by doing less, we did more. So by streamlining and better understanding the user groups, segments, personas, if you will, and focusing on delivering tools, services, and content in the way they want and the way that was most effective, and putting in measurement plans before we launched, we were able to have a very large successful uptick for return on investment for the company's overall investment across agency partners. Just to caveat, New Solutions Factory is not an advertising agency. We don't produce full creative pieces. We are a consultancy.
Okay, so here's another case study, and this one is in the clinical stage of the world. And so actually it kind of crosses all of them. But in this particular case, a company had a new data from a clinical trial was released that was kind of a game-changing set of data. And they understood they had a few challenges with that. Number one is they needed to get that information out, but also knew it would change in a pretty fundamental way, they thought, how clinicians would practice medicine. And like a lot of organizations, this company had, and this particular brand, had a pretty robust kind of KOL tiered network, if you will, a key opinion leader tiered network, where they knew who the national industry thought leaders were, and they interacted with them in the normal sorts of ways that life science companies do. They also knew who some of their regional kind of heavy reputation folks were within the U.S. But what they didn't get a lot of access to was, what is the practicing physician who is not kind of heavy in reputation? What are they understanding or experiencing as it pertains to this new information and data, and how might this change what they are going to do? They also were in a scenario where, again, like most companies, they had a field force, both on the commercial and the medical side, and the field force was responsible for forming a lot of those relationships, and they wanted to do something in a way that they could approach from a regional basis. Are they seeing any changes in, in kind of the state of care based on the new information that's coming out, but also do something where they could roll it back up into their existing organization and have the folks in different regions actually moderate the discussion. And so what they did was they actually created 7 different online environments, one for each region, that existed for a shorter period of time. And each of those regions was moderated by an MSL from that particular area. And into each of those regions, they invited a set of advisors. They ran it kind of like a breakout ad board, if you will. And over the course of a week, those advisors were interacting with those moderators on a set of questions, reviewing the data, getting their thoughts, going back and forth on what, if anything, mattered to them, of what they've seen, how they might change what it is that they're doing. And then rolling all of that up, this is an example, again, of the type of platform that we're talking about. This is generic data. This is the actual real content. It was not ADHD. But using a platform that allowed people to go in, interact, talk to each other, make comments back and forth, interact safely with the moderator, do that over a mobile device or over the web, and most importantly, do it whenever it's convenient for them. So before rounds, after seeing patients, over the weekend, whenever it was convenient for these folks in the different regions who are all very busy clinicians with very full days packed with patient meetings, enabled them to get a very robust amount of feedback in that 7-day period. Overall, across the 42 advisors that participated in this particular program, you can see they got over 1,700 comments on a wide variety of issues pertaining what they do, and they could actually sort and look at them and compare what different regions are doing or what the perceptions are in different regions versus others, and that helped them form strategy and understanding around what they may need to do from an awareness perspective, or different sorts of educational materials that may make more sense to help the field interpret the information that was happening in the disease state. They also, in this particular case, found it very valuable in that they don't typically engage, as I mentioned, kind of these frontline physicians anywhere near in the same way that they would maybe the national thought leaders. And so providing this forum and doing it at a cost point that made sense for them really benefited them, and really was another lens to look at their understanding of trends in the space and that sort of thing. And so overall, it was a very, very highly successful program. They got a tremendous amount of response from these physicians, and also in surveying all the participants afterwards, got very, very high marks for their innovation and very high satisfaction marks for allowing them to participate in this type of format that is most convenient to their schedules. So that's another example of an organization that is creating these online discussion environments in a little bit of a smaller scale, tailored more for their specific use and their specific issues. In this example, subsequent to this, further work has been done with these different groups, but this was kind of the first broad approach that they took to develop this sort of program and use a social media-like tool or interaction to draw out very specific and very candid feedback about the marketplace. Okay, so back to you, Natanya.
Okay, and keeping mindful of time, I will tee this up with, there are shades of gray again around the way we would collect things, what we were looking at, but in this case, trying to bridge again even closer the interconnectedness between customers and stakeholders. And this is something that many of you have probably experienced in your lifetime in the pharmaceutical industry or in your personal life, quite frankly, in that health literacy is often a check-the-box type thing on the bucket list of things we need to do when we have any patient education materials. And it's usually managed by the group that works with the direct-to-patient materials and production. And what we wanted to look at, or what we had a sense of from a client that we examined quickly, was, does health literacy really matter to the physician, to the relationship between the physician and the patient, or care partner and caregiver? Does it impact health outcomes? Because there were some indications that that was already the case. And what we brought to them were some studies that had already monitored and tracked this, that yes, indeed, down to medication errors and adherence challenges that had resulted, unfortunately, either in death or in other complications, hospitalizations, all about these disconnects. The thing that was interesting was that these types of things transcend age, race, socioeconomic status, education, for a number of reasons, and that understanding what health literacy means and its role in the doctor-patient communication can really affect some positive change on both sides. One of the things that was most interesting was the disconnect between the physician's perception of their patient's understanding and the patient's perception of the same experience. In some ways, it's that the patients give a great deal of credibility and respect to their patients, that if they say, my instructions are X, Y, Z, is that clear? And the patient says yes, and there are no cognitive impairments, that they move on to the next topic. Or there might be a litany of instructions that are to be followed across different medications, maybe devices involved, different types of treatment settings, and all of that is given to the patient at one time, potentially in that setting, or across settings. And so we wanted to quantify, rather than just qualify, some of these disconnects and how they occurred, so that we could better not just empower and enable the patient education side, but the physicians and allied health professionals that worked in their offices to be aware of some of these often stated disconnects. So we looked at a correlation between exact time in clinical treatment paradigm from diagnosis, treatment instructions across very distinct types of communication points, and matched them up from physicians and patients, and within the platform and technologies that we spoke about, be able to get authentic feedback such that patients indeed reported that they had over-reported their understanding to physicians, that they didn't want to look foolish, or that they were basically sort of on autopilot because of other emotional issues that they were feeling. Many of you could probably relate to this, or someone in your life. It's not that you don't have the capacity to understand, it's just that there are other barriers at that time that are kind of getting in the way of your cognitive ability. So essentially, if you have trouble reading something, or something, there are medical terms that are unfamiliar, you're feeling physical or emotional stress, or it's your loved one, or you're coping with this new diagnosis or an onset of illness, it can really affect your ability to actually take in information in the way that you would maybe otherwise. There's another analogy that's often about the emergency room, as the way you show up in the emergency room is really the worst day of your life, and that's the way it can feel. Are you able to process all of the information? And layering that with some other statistics that are out there around what are comprehension levels in the United States across language and cultural variations, many of the materials that are produced, even with a large movement manufacturers really supporting the concept of health literacy, they're really still not being strict about how much of a lens they need to put on everything that they produce for patients and care partners, and even allied health and things that are in office for reading level. Again, reading level is just one dimension of health literacy, but it's one of the ones that are able to be tracked. Ultimately, what we'd really like to do, and what we did with this client, was show that there are these independent and measurable connections between health literacy and outcomes using studies that existed, and we're able to quickly build a case around why it was important to maybe readjust some of the messaging and content in certain areas, and then ultimately track, and there's a longitudinal study in place, the differences in terms of rehospitalization, reported relationships between the patient and their healthcare team. Also, ultimately, having physicians have found in the primary so far survey results have found that they also report a higher strength and confidence in the clinical outcome, although the treatment given did not change.
So with that, I think we'll pause. So those were 5 case studies that all have a few things in common to kind of bring them all back together. So number one, they all took advantage of social media in one or more of these categories, either basic social media and the conversations that were happening there, the kind of the Facebook for Doctors sites or networks, and or the organization-owned sites. And what it represents is the understanding that a lot of really innovative teams are really coming to grips with as time goes by, that every day within these sites, there is more and more and more of a record of conversation, sentiment, what's happening, whether they're kind of broad, unstructured sets of things like the larger communities, or whether they are environments that are set up and tailored and specifically for certain types of conversations and outcomes. And by listening and engaging in these different venues, having them all be within the mix, if you will, and looking across them all holistically, and doing some of the analysis and some of the examples that Natanya gave, it really does provide a level of insight and understanding and actionable things that can be added to the strategy that really didn't exist even a couple of years ago, certainly nowhere close to the way that they do now. And so I think, you know, to the degree of what we see when we look at our numbers, the use of all of these different sets or categories, if you will, of social media-based or online discussion-based platforms is really increasing at a very rapid rate, both U.S. and internationally. We're seeing them being used also where the genesis kind of started off in kind of medical affairs / commercial, also pushing back into clinical phase and R&D. And then finally, as was mentioned earlier, although I didn't give a case study around payer, different audiences, payer, patients, caregivers, HCPs, all of them using these types of venues to help understand, analyze, get better information, and ultimately build better strategies and serve patients better. And I think as the years unfold, the next couple of years, I think this trend is really going to increase. I think you're going to see more organization-owned sites, either the shorter duration ones or the overall online ones. As people get more used to and comfortable with this, I think you're going to see a lot more opportunities for the types of analysis that firms like Natanya does on some of the verbatim conversation and comparing that to the types of activities or discussions that are happening across different sets of sites, kind of in the hierarchy, if you will. And then finally, I think what's going to happen is we're certainly seeing that it is becoming more and more commonplace for each of the different constituencies to use these sites in a professional capacity without really thinking it new or novel. It just kind of is what they do. So with that, I'm going to pause and open it up for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the GoToMeeting webinar interface. I'm going to break for about 30 seconds here and give people time to type some questions in, and then I will start fielding them for myself and Natanya. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start through the list, and again, feel free to keep typing questions in as we're going. So the first question is around compliance. I think it's meant to both us and both within 3 and New Solutions Factory. What is the role of compliance in manufacturers participating in this type of work? I'll hit it from the venue side for a minute, and then I'll maybe shift over to Natanya. You can maybe hit it in terms of what it means in terms of the types of analysis that her firm does. From the venue side, a big watershed moment was the 2014 social media guidance in the U.S. that the FDA put out, the draft guidance, that very specifically outlined how pharmaceutical companies and life science companies can interact in the different types of social venues. Prior to that guidance coming out, it was really left up to each company to try to innovate where they could, but also be extremely careful, not understanding if they were going to cross the line that the FDA would not appreciate. Post that guidance, I think we've seen an explosion because the guidance is pretty clear and it cites very specific examples of what is allowed. A real explosion of usage of these venues in all different ways in line with that guidance, and that even companies who traditionally would consider themselves very, very conservative are now looking at and using these different sorts of venues in different parts of their business. In terms of what it means in terms of access to that information, I'll maybe direct that question to Natanya.
Sure. Following on, there still seems to be some variation once you get granular around how the information is not only collected, shared, distributed, and reported within a company and between customers, but obviously publicly. When we are engaging with our different kinds of clients and customers and agency partners, we are all very clear about what the compliance protocols are from the macro level as well as within the organization that we're working with. What that can mean is that sometimes for example, the speakers themselves are de-identified, but the content is not. The location or certain elements around, depending on what those protocols are going to be blinded from being shared. That still doesn't get in the way of us being effective to understand change, and usually we have enough identifiers to understand something, to know if something is a regional incidence or a national incidence. We can have other data layered on to get a sense of heat mapping where what is what, rather than having direct access and violating any compliance regulations. It's a critical component, especially when we're also talking about interplay between patient and physician, treatment discussions. What is the line between educating and driving? That is constantly, something that clients are working through within their companies around that balance of being compliant. But ultimately, if the goal is better engagement, comprehension, understanding, and change, then the decision to use a product or take a medication a certain way is not necessarily what we are focusing on driving. So compliance isn't necessarily, in any way a hindrance. Just something we have to be mindful of.
Okay, great, thanks. So next question is, how do insights from online communities compare with traditional market research venues such as an in-person ad board or a focus group? Maybe I'll let you take that one first, Natanya.
I'm sorry. I didn't actually quite get that.
Yeah, the question was, how do insights from an online communities or social media venues compare with traditional market research sources such as an ad board or a focus group, et cetera?
Yes, apologies, because I was looking up a stat about adverse event reporting and compliance, and it distracted me. Apologies to the group. Yes, I think that with all due respect to market research, traditional market research, because I also have deep roots there, and I think there is a lot of that is still, these are the foundational pillars of how we do business. So those are still very much needed. I think the difference is in what we described is, quite frankly, a little bit more rapid fire and bridge building with analogs and models. And I spoke about that to say, unfortunately, and I hope this is not blasphemous, we're not all so unique, all of us as humans, as individuals. And we often have behaviors that repeat based on certain things that are attributes about us, or times in our life, a life stage, or something that we're going through. There may be variants within that, but even those cluster into types. Whether you're a physician, a managed care leader, a pharmacist, you know, a mother of four, a single dad, a person, and, you know, planning their end of life. So with all of that, we're able to kind of do cross-sections of getting from point A to point B, perhaps a little more quickly, but we have to often leverage and utilize any foundational research to be able to do that.
Okay, great. And I'm going to answer, we have time for one more question. So with all of the different choices available, the different types of sites and things, how does a company get attention or rise above the noise, if you will, and know kind of where to engage or participate? I guess I would answer that a couple of different ways. So number one is, I think what our information shows is, especially as you kind of move up from basic social media up into the other areas, that the way stakeholders interact in these different environments tends to become focused and more specialized as you go up that chart from basic social media to kind of the Facebook for Doctors, commercial networks, to very specific organizationally owned sites. And so just like other types of kind of multi-channel outreach, understanding what that footprint is very, very important to kind of know where you should spend time or focus time. And secondly, I think especially again as you kind of go up the food chain, because you can have more specific value propositions, because you can tend to integrate more specific information in a context relative to, you know, to a health organization or records or, you know, confidential or drug or brand information. What that allows you to do is have a value prop that is very different than anything that's elsewhere on the internet that lacks that more specific information. And so we've not seen on our side really much issue with I'm not going to interact because I'm in so many of these other sites and I don't have time. Rather the opposite. What we tend to see is organizations that are embracing this type of communication, this style of kind of social media discussion communication, and then making it unique by tailoring it towards specific communication need areas, are getting the opposite. They're getting really great kudos. They're really being viewed as innovators, and thirdly, they're getting a lot of very specific value. So this is not, the market is not yet at a point where you know, there's 1,000 websites and how do I know which one to get to sort of thing. It's still in a point where those organizations who are really innovating and moving fast are claiming some ground and forming some great relationships and some really innovative programs with these different sets of audiences. Okay, so with that, unfortunately, I think we're out of time for more questions. We will certainly try to get back to everyone who has asked a question in writing, and feel free after the fact as well to contact us through either of our websites or on the information that you see here on the screen, and we'll be as responsive as we can. Thanks so much, and Steve, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Lance and Natanya, for the very interesting case studies and sharing your insights and experience. We greatly appreciate it. I'd like to thank all the attendees again for participating. Again, we have recorded this. We'll make the recording available, and we hope to see you at future programs and events. Have a pleasant afternoon.